All right, it looks like we are live. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to another live stream on this channel. I am once again Raging Mandrill, and I'm joined today by an excellent guest who I've chosen for a very particular reason. He's a very awesome and based gentleman, and he's very intelligent. And I brought him on today to review a book which has been recently put out by Skeptical Waves, of course, which I asked Skeptical Waves to put out for us. And it's a book called On Being a Pagan, and it's by Alain de Benoist. And if you've been in any sort of right-wing circles, you know eventually things are going to come to a sort of, pagan and Christian split, inevitably. And this book is an interesting one because it displays the reasons of why these splits tend to occur on a theological level. And anyway, so welcome, Philos. I appreciate you coming on. Hello?
Oh, yeah, I'm here just navigating between windows. Yeah, just wanted to thank you for having me. I've met Mandrill a few times IRL at the events, and it's a very fascinating book that we're looking on here on Being a Pagan. I've looked up some other secondary sources, I've assembled some questions, and we kind of want this to not necessarily be some debate where we're trying to prove one position against the other, but more of a conversation and to try and kind of find a way forward here. And I found the book absolutely fascinating. And just a brief plug for my channel. I run Philos Miscellany, which is a YouTube channel. I've been on Dave the Distributist's stream, along with Anglo Ortho and Yiz the Eunuch. And generally what my channel does is I kind of offer 10-minute video essay reviews of various based or obscure books, with the understanding that print media is becoming less and less common. And despite rumors to the contrary, the right does have a very intense and rich history of both intellectual and religious. So I have a series where I put out one video every 2 or 3 weeks or so, and I just give a brief 10-minute overview of the book's plot. Some books that I've done in the past are Black Magic by Kenneth Roberts, which is about the first reference and understanding to Hitler's beer hall push and Mussolini's fascists. My second book was on the secret archives of the Vatican and their history there and their relationship to Western civilization. And my third upcoming book is about the Southern history of the Civil War, which is a history of the American Civil War from a Southern perspective. I've also put out another shorter video that compares and contrasts the cyclical history worldview of Arnold Toynbee against Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who, as a little-known fact, wrote his Harvard senior thesis on Spengler, Toynbee, and Kant. So that's kind of my channel in a nutshell. Please feel free to check it out, and thank you once again, Mandrill, for having me on.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm actually the first thing that I saw on your channel that stood out to me was that Toynbee video. Of course, I think I did a review of Spengler, his thesis with Prudentialist at some point, if I remember correctly. That was a couple months ago. But yeah, that's an interesting perspective. And I brought you on specifically for one very, very important reason, and it has a little bit to do with your background. Would you care to explain a bit about your background so that we can elaborate for the audience a little bit?
Certainly. So I'm born and raised Jewish as a Reform Jew. I had a bar mitzvah, I had a confirmation, 15 years of kind of rudimentary religious education. I lived in Israel for several years. I speak Hebrew. And I'm aiming today to kind of represent the Jewish take on this text and kind of the overall view of Judaism as a whole. But I want to argue that I'm not a practicing Jew at the moment. I'm currently inquiring into Orthodox Christianity. And if I knew enough, I would be happy to kind of represent the Christian position, but I'm not going to do that because, frankly, I don't know enough at this point. And I think there's enough material here from the Jewish point of view to kind of give a little bit more clarity or insight into both the text and then also a monotheistic religion that isn't pagan but also isn't Christian. So I think it's a very unique perspective that I can offer.
Yeah, and the main reason why I think your background is excellent for analyzing this work is because de Benoist actually cites a lot of literature and Jewish sources and a lot of Hebrew theology, um, which is not really my wheelhouse, nor do I think it's really the wheelhouse of anybody in the dissonant right, save for maybe a very, very exclusive few people. And so that's the reason why I wanted you to come on, is because I needed somebody who wasn't a Christian who could give me his take on whether this book makes sense, and his analysis of Judaism makes sense. So that's really why I brought Philo on, guys. So with that, I think we can go ahead and start talking about the book proper. It's If I could just give a quick introduction for it. This is one which had, like a lot of foreign sources, especially French sources, from the dissonant right or the radical right or whatever you want to call it, seems to find difficulty in being translated into English. And I'm sure there's all sorts of reasons for that, but mostly it's probably just because I don't speak French. I speak a little German. Mostly Spanish is what I had an education in, and of course this was originally published in French in the early '80s. It was edited by Greg Johnson of Countercurrents fame, and it's that was in 2004, right? So really, this book is very recent in English discourse in the Anglosphere at large. It's a very new book for that reason. It's only 20 years old, so the full implications on an ideological level or a moral or whatever political level, I don't really think have been fully felt. So it's probably important to analyze the book for that reason. So with that introduction to the actual book itself out of the way, let's go ahead and actually get into the analysis of the text. What part of the book stood out to you the most, Philo?
Goodness. There were a variety of sections that I just kind of pulled from. I guess early on, I'll have to throw you some chapters here, but I guess looking at page 10, I have a good quote that I can read out that we can look at.
Sure.
Basically, on page 10, kind of midway down the page, you'll find, quote, "It is less the disappearance of paganism than its reemergence under primitive or puerile forms, kin to that second religiosity that Spengler rightly described as one of the characteristic traits of cultures in decline. This is also what Julius Evola wrote about as generally corresponding to a phenomenon of escape, alienation, and confused compensation, which is of no serious consequence on reality, something hybrid, decrepit, and sub-intellectual," end quote. So the reason why I think that's important is because it's important to understand that I think paganism doesn't exist as a like dissident ideology with an omnipresent Christian world. We live in this world of many different faiths. There are Hindus, there are Buddhists, Jews, Christians, Muslims, various pagan or Zoroastrian or shamanic cultures, and all of this means that there's a bunch of different denominations across each faith. But in addition to this very religious world that we live in, we also have a very decrepit modern world. So we have a world in which meta narratives are kind of abandoned. People run into this issue where they don't necessarily have like a comprehensive culture or land or religion or ancestor cadre that they fit into, right? People don't live in the Amish bubble of their religion. They live in a religion which is always in tension with the world and also in tension with other religions. So this has kind of produced a era in which people become very critical not only of religion but of any kind of overarching structure above kind of the nature of the individual. Morality becomes very gray, very relativistic, very secularized. This is also how you have the rise of very evil things in our world. Let me know if there's anything I can't say on YouTube, but you have various gender changes. You have various things that are perverse or immoral. You have kind of the destruction of the family. You have the atomization of the individual. So basically, this kind of, as I understood this quote, the world in which we live is kind of rediscovering paganism in a sense. More and more people are practicing the occult or something like Wicca. There's ancestor worship. There's also, this kind of goes all over the political spectrum, but it could be, neo-feminist witches at Stonehenge, or it could be somebody on Twitter posting about the Indo-Europeans, that there's this massive desire for a new kind of system that breaks out of these more formal and rigid religions and can kind of establish a new order in the world. So I would agree with this quote that we live in very decadent and declining times, and I'm sure you'd agree, Mandrel, that these are not the best of times to be a young man in. And with that, I'll kick it back to you.
Yeah. Surprisingly, I'm looking over my copy of the text here, and I did not have a single highlight in the chapter on time and history, which is rather surprising to me. For me, the chapters that stood out to me were, I always say that they're between 13 and 15, I think, which is it's Space and Time, Iconoclasm and Beauty, and what's chapter 15? Let's see, the universal and the particular. And those are basically the three chapters which are probably the most relevant to people on the dissident right, if they're going to read any of it, because you want to understand why exactly these little conflicts pop up over and over again on the dissident right between the Tradcath faction and between like the Baptist, types. And there's a very distinct reason for that. And de Benoist, he wrote a theology book, basically. This book is not a book on history per se. It's not a book on sociology or culture or any sort of political polemic or anything like that. It's not a treatise. It's not like here's why you should go be a pagan or whatever. No, it doesn't. There's nothing in here about any sort of specific ritual practices or anything like that. It's more of a pure theology book, which is very interesting. And so I guess since you are actually somebody with the Jewish background, I would like to ask your opinion on the accuracy of his take on Judaism and on Jewish theology in general. Now, there's much more of a criticism of Christianity, of course, than of Judaism. He, as I understand, de Benoist is a little more tame than others in the dissident right on the JQ, if that makes sense. And there's reasons for that other people have given their takes on. That's beyond the scope of what I want to talk about here today. But anyway, he has some interesting methods that he uses, and he's very good at giving citations. Like, I'd say that's probably one of the more annoying things is that he writes like like Hans Hermann Hoppe, right? If you ever read Democracy, the God That Failed, like there are sections in that book where half the page is like a footnote, and de Benoist is very thorough. And I'm just flipping through my pages now, and he's got a citation or multiple citations on every single page. Um, so he seems very well researched, at least at first glance. So if you could go ahead and give your take on the theological part comparing Judaism,
For
please.
sure. I mean, I think before I get into Benoit's criticism of Judaism, I just want to kind of state like generally what Jews believe, because I think that will give us a point to contrast against. So these come down from Moshe ben Maimon, who's also known as Maimonides in Judaism. He's sort of the greatest sage. Nearly every reference in the Midrash or any kind of rabbinical criticism harkens back to him. So he wrote down 13 principles of the Jewish faith. So generally, these are considered in Judaism to be the minimum requirements of Jewish belief. And already you'll see as I read them that it's pretty distinct from Christianity, which is Trinitarian, believes in bodily resurrection, also believes in the incarnation of God in man. These are things which Judaism doesn't necessarily hold about Christ. So just going over these, God exists. God is one and unique. God is incorporeal, so he's without a body. God is
Right.
eternal. When you pray, prayer is to be directed to God alone and nothing or no one else, to no other gods. The words of the prophet of the Torah are true. Moses' prophecies are true, and Moshe was also the greatest of all the prophets. The written Torah, so these are the 5 first books of the Bible, and the oral Torah, so these are teachings of the rabbis now, not the rabbis, these are teachings that are now within the Talmud and other kind of writings like the Midrash and the commentaries. Originally, they all come from Moses as well. Besides that, there will be no other Torah from God to man. This is it. God knows the thoughts and deeds of men. He is omniscient. God will reward the good and punish the wicked. The Messiah will come, and that the dead will be resurrected. This point's a little more nuanced because ancient Jews believed in both bodily and spiritual resurrection, but modern Judaism holds that the dead will be resurrected only in spirit. So basically, these are kind of the 13 main tenets of Judaism. So, how does this kind of work within Judaism? Like, what does it actually mean to be a practicing Jew? So, as as a Jewish person, uh, the general principle, like overall, kind of overlaps with Christianity. You're supposed to abstain from excessive indulgence in bodily pleasures. You have the 613 mitzvot, and the mitzvot are like they're, you know, this, do and do not, thou shalt and thou shalt not. Um, and if you abide by these, you will live a righteous and holy life. Uh, Judaism is regenerative and eternal. So every year in Judaism, on the day of Yom Kippur, we repent for our sins. And then we also have Rosh Hashanah, which is the new year, and kind of the storytelling of God's creation restarts from the beginning of the 5 books. And that this cycle has continued unbroken in Judaism for almost 6,000 years. In Judaism, let me know if I'm going on too much, but in
No, go
Judaism,
ahead.
to pray in Hebrew is lehitpalel, which means that we judge ourselves before God, and thereby through prayer and through a change in action that we can make ourselves into better human beings. Um, the sages of Judaism know that very few people are capable of truly expressing their inmost thoughts or desires. I mean, just you can picture somebody, how many people in this world are really honest all the time about what they believe, what they want to believe, where they are. So in Judaism, we kind of fix that, so to speak, by standardizing prayer into our ritual prayer, which is in a book called the Siddur. Jews generally should pray together in a minyan, which means a group of 10 or more people, where men and women are separate. And we are also supposed to pray in a congregation, tefillah b'tzibur, because Judaism is a communal religion above all else. Any synagogue in the world, unless it's either corrupted through secularism or modernism, or it's just generally less observant, it will always have the same prayers, the same structures, and the same order. So all of this prayer structure was consolidated around 485 BC, and the structure is pretty unchanged since then. There's a lot of academic debate on that, but it's too much for right now. Some other core things to know about Judaism is that all of our holidays, the Sukkot, Tisha B'Av, the Festival of the Trees, all of our holidays in our religion are connected to our ancient agrarian ways as a people, and they retell our communal history. Jews are also one of the few religions in the world that's passed through the generations by blood. So if I have a genetic test done, I can tell that I have Ashkenazi Jewish DNA. It's a genetic marker within me in the same way that you can tell genetically that somebody is Italian or British or whatever. So, what is man's relationship for God? Basically, we kind of view God as, he doesn't have a body that we can comprehend. Whenever Moses looks upon God, it's always through a burning bush. Even in the New Testament, it's kind of a separate point. But when Jesus looks upon God, and when he exposes his true uncreated divine energy to the apostles, it's not the full power of God, because it is not something that mortal man can comprehend. So
Yes. This is okay. So this is probably a good point to actually really jump into it. Right. You're referencing the typically Abrahamic and Christian view, in our case, in our context, of the divine, right? And this is more of, at least from de Benoist's perspective, this is cosmology, right? This isn't really a theological perspective. This is a cosmological perspective, right? And I think when he talks about how the divine is perceived physically, he has an interesting. I'm trying to figure out which chapter it's in. I can't find it off the top of my head. Anyway, the what he says is the the divine is in a separate world, right, from the Abrahamic religious perspective, right? And so there comes with it this sort of idea of formlessness, as well as this a degree of separation, really, as the bumper stickers tell us. Christ's kingdom is not of this world, correct? Which is very interesting, because that's one of the first theological distinctions between a pagan and a Christian or a Jew. And the issue that say, and really, I think de Benoist attributes this to the nature of the desert. He basically thinks that there's a reason why the desert and why the form religiously of an empty temple seems to predominate in the desert. And he thinks it's because it's emptiness. And so if you're in a very, very empty place, the way that you're going to find the divine basically is through emptiness and through silence and through verbalization, because you're not gonna there's just nothing around you. The only way that you're going to be able to, it's almost like if you think about a Bedouin who's crossing the desert on a camel or something, and nobody's around him, and who does he have to talk to other than himself in his own head, or just talking to himself aloud. And of course, if you think about somebody, like is very common in the Bible, they happen across a burning bush, or they just get struck by lightning almost, and they just have a thought pop into their head. And this is probably vulgarizing it a little bit, unfortunately. verbalization of this is probably not so good. But you get the point, right? There's a distinction there in cosmology, because there's a separation um, between God and God's realm and the actual physical realm of the world. There's all sorts of things that start popping up, and the difference is, for a pagan, there's no distinction of the world, right? Obviously, if you know the Norse or Germanic religions, as everybody, I'm sure, has had some passing familiarity with at this point, um, the cosmological difference is there's no separation, right? Like, all realms of the universe are connected on one stem. Um, and so, the idea of that the gods are not of the world is not correct from a pagan perspective. It's that the gods are actually present in the world. They live in the world. They are of the world, and there is no other world, basically, to put it very bluntly, from in my view. Um, so really, I think that's one of the first real distinctions. And I think there's also a counter to this. De Benoist doesn't really go into it, but just one of my little observations and thoughts is, okay, well, if you have this sort of, like, lightning striking as a thunderbolt from out of thin air, right, which is more of how an Abrahamic religion perceives, revelation from God. There seems to be, and that's of course associated with the emptiness of the desert. Well, turn that on its inverse, and you end up with what happens if people are in a forest. What do they typically see? Is there a reason why they might come to believe in things like fairies and forest spirits, and have a more, shall we say, polytheistic view of the world? Um, so I just had an interesting. That's just my interesting take on it.
Yeah, and I think, and I'm hoping I'm getting the theology right, but so nowhere in the Torah does Judaism say there are no other gods. It basically says that God is supreme and a unity, so that you shouldn't worship an idol. The reason you shouldn't practice idolatry is because there is only one true God. There is only one metaphysical, uh, you know, entity that is responsible for the creation of all things, and within this, all other things are contained. Um, Basically, the idolatry is the worship of a false god in opposition to a true god. So this kind of brings up an interesting thing where um, there's also, within Judaism and Christianity, there's a panoply of angels and demons. Um, you don't necessarily, it's a little murky, the theology of this, but heaven and hell isn't as distinct in Judaism as it is in Christianity. So, for example, like in Judaism, there's the concept of Gehenna, but it's not really something that's brought up as something that you are either predestined to go to, or that you can accumulate some kind of balance of sins that you will be sent to hell. It's far more of I guess, a positive vision that the Jews eventually, over time, there's the concept of like tikkun olam, which is kind of harkens back to your concept of space, which is that like eventually, like the Jews, through their, and this is it's very egotistical on the part of the Jews. This is why I'm inquiring into Orthodox Christianity, but basically that Jews will set such an example as a group that they will, all other Gentiles and nations of the earth will follow them in their righteous conduct. And then as that happens, the Messiah occurs in Judaism. Basically, they assert that Christ is not the Messiah. This has to do with some very technical passages in the book of Isaiah, where the Hebrew is in a little bit of dispute. When I read that criticism by Rabbi Tobiah Singer, I actually found that it was more compelling that Christ is the Messiah than whatever the Jewish version of the Messiah will be. But there is some kind of, there is an understanding that the Jews as a people recognize the one true God. And this is where you get into this very interesting concept of God in Judaism, where you've heard of the Jehovah's Witnesses. This is basically
Sure.
the true name of God is Jehovah or Yahweh or whatever. It's actually not quite true. In the Hebrew, it's Yud He Vav He, and what that means is each of the four letters represent kind of a different state of the verb is. So Judaism is all about uh, it's all about verbs, and it actually, as a
Yes.
etymological point, it doesn't have the word is anywhere in it. But basically, the four letters roughly correspond to was, is, will be, and shall be. So this is where you get kind of that message of the eternal. And what was interesting is I think that um, out of any of the monotheistic religions, I think there's a lot of the pagan perspective, I suppose, on this, that there is the eternal, and that there is the uh, how do I put this, the kind of the omnipresence of gods kind of is similar to the omnipresence of God, but in Judaism, like 100%, there are no other gods but Adonai, Elohim, and there's a reverence for that God concept that allows for this space, like you're saying. There's a space in Judaism between man and God. Since there's not that incarnation, you cannot call God by his true name. Any word that you see that refers to God in the Torah is actually some kind of substitute, like Elohim, Adonai. Um, these are all kind of stand-ins. It's the nameless one, or the name Hashem. So these are all to kind of creating this sort of distance between it.
Mhm.
And without that incarnation, I mean, it's this is why I don't like the thing Ben Shapiro does, and
Well,
sometimes that Alain de Benoist does, which is basically like it's conflating Judeo and Christian. Like,
Mhm.
these are not the same religions. They're very, very distinct, and there's a lot of shared heritage, but a lot of their presuppositions, a lot of their main tenets, a lot of the way in which they practice, very, very different religions.
Yeah, I wonder if that's a bit dated at this point, because I mean this was written in the early '80s at the height of what we call boomer truth, and
Mhm.
I of course as everybody loves to point out on Twitter with their word graphs or whatever, if the incidence of the word Judeo-Christian that only happens after pretty much 1945.
Mhm.
So I wonder if that's his way of kind of like saying no, this Judeo, this this weird. I wonder because like de Benoist as a figure, he's weirdly Nazgul, but he's also weirdly on board with a lot of things in Boomer Truth. Like he's very much a man of his time and place, which is post-war France. And of course, if you know anything about post-war France, there's a lot of postmodern philosophy and things like that are going on at the same time. So I'm sure he's aware of all of that. But yeah, so that's a very interesting point. I think this might also be an interesting jump off point to, because obviously you mentioned the word of God, as you would put it, in Indiana Jones language. So there's an interesting section that he has in here, which I think it's in Iconoclasm and Beauty, and he essentially says that the way that the Abrahamic religions, Christianity especially, but also very much Judaism as well, they tend to define how one comes to the truth, how one comes to the divine through the word. And of course, with your wonderful explanation on the linguistics of the very word of God, I think that it illustrates that point very well. He takes a totally different view, and I've had dialogues with Christians and such before on how one comes to finding the truth, and I tend to agree with de Benoist that the way that one should come to the truth is through the image and through the deed, and those two things should be combined. Really, you because obviously if you have an image, you can be fooled by images as well, and that's why they have to go together. Um, so I think that's another interesting distinction as well. If you'd like to just to
Yeah.
go
So
into it.
the very interesting point to build off that is that Judaism traditionally has no icons or depictions of God. And if you go into a synagogue, the artistic motifs that you're going to see are usually going to be of plants and animals, stained glass, or portraits. Um, this is anything from the art of Marc Chagall all the way back to the Roman mosaics in the time of the Second Temple and earlier. That basically you it's very difficult to visually or through an image portray what God is. It's a sin. It violates the Ten Commandments to do this. It's the reason why
Correct.
it's the second it's the second maybe the first commandment. I'm spacing here, but you shall not have any other gods besides me. Um,
Yeah, you shall
and
not worship any graven image. Right. That's the one you're
yep,
thinking of.
yep,
Yeah.
that's found in Exodus.
Yeah.
And so there's an interesting thing where um, what does that actually make Judaism become if it's not the image? Well, it's sort of, for a long period of time, thousands of years, Judaism was in the diaspora period, which is basically in exile. It was cast out of Israel with the destruction of the Second Temple. There were very, very hard times. Jews spread all throughout the world. And the kind of yearning of the Jewish people, very, very traditionally, and at the core center of Judaism, was this desire to turn to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. And there's a very interesting relationship between Judaism and land. So the Hebrew term for the United States, weirdly enough, is called Laotzot Habrit, which means the land of the covenant, because they adopted like the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and so created this moral framework for themselves. But I mean, if you assess Judaism today, it's in a very interesting place because Jews live in Israel. There is the secular state of Israel, but then within it, there is the theological, uh, how do I put this? Like the state of modern Judaism that does not recognize the secular state, but believes that it can only be manifested and that the third temple can only be built um, when the Messiah comes. So a lot of the more theocratic Jews in Israel, they actually don't speak Hebrew because you're not supposed to speak Hebrew until Messiah comes. It just in the same way that you're not supposed to reference the true name of God until you are what's called a Kohanim, which is like a priestly Jewish person. And in general, the priest class, the Kohanim within Judaism, has uh, authority over the Levites. So they have authority over um, basically other Jews. So even to this day, like certain families in Judaism will be Kohanim, so they can lead the Shabbat service. They can lead the Kaddish, which is the blessing in Shabbat. Um, but Judaism is in a very interesting place now, where we have the land, where we have Hebrew revived as a language. We have our culture, we have our customs. Um, we have our historical sites, but then we also have this huge population of diaspora. And so it's this like internal tension between, do we return to the secular land, or do we wait until the theological land is established? And there's a bunch of very strange things within Judaism. So out of the 613 mitzvot, I think between 70 and 100 of them can only be practiced when the temple is built. So Judaism essentially is not like a fully fulfilled religion until the temple exists with animal sacrifice and prayer in this very religious and fastidious way. Um, so it very much is a religion that's kind of out of step with itself, or not really fully fulfilling what it ought to be. So this is this sort of very strange predicament for a Jewish person to be in, where you can go to Israel and you can live there and you can speak Hebrew, but you're not living the full practice of Judaism. Nobody is living the full practice of Judaism. You're always kind of substituting it or having a stand-in or having some type of cope until like the theocratic state comes with the Messiah, with the basically the turning of the nations to follow the lead of the Jewish people. And in that time, the prophecy will be fulfilled. So there's this weird sense of past, present, and future. And what I like about On Being a Pagan is basically he makes this point early on in the book, I think the first or second chapter, where he says that basically the past only has value in as much as it reoccurs in the present. This is kind of a pagan principle. And so in Judaism, there is that
Yeah,
null where you're
I think.
always, yeah.
Yeah, I think de Benoist references Nietzsche there, and he uses the words eternal return, and he capitalizes those two words, of course. So yeah, that perspective is definitely present as well. The Nietzschean influences.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's also that, throughout the centuries, Judaism increasingly redefined itself in opposition to Christianity. It had to differentiate itself, change some of its doctrines. Even the Rambam, that very sacred sage that I mentioned, he was basically a Neoplatonist. And that becomes very interesting because in Benoist, he references a lot of Platonism and a lot of these Greek and Roman pagan ideas and traditions that kind of undergird Platonism in a sense. But I don't want to get too necessarily bogged down in that. I think, uh, you know, on page 89, the Zohar, which is this very, it's this body of various rabbinical commentaries within Judaism. It says, quote, the Messianic world will be a world without images in which there will no longer be any comparison possible between the image and what it represents. So basically what you're going to see is you will become one and you will understand all reality. You will be joined with this oneness. And, it's a very intensely metaphysical idea that carries a lot of significance for Jews. So,
Yeah,
yep.
the imagery is an interesting aspect of this distinction as well. Really, I mean, every single chapter he's got here, he basically says, okay, here's what the Christian view or here's what the Jewish view is, and here's why that's wrong or why I don't agree with it. So every single, it's like literally a compare and contrast on every issue you could conceivably think of. And of course, he references the what is it? Iconoclasm and beauty. Now, yeah, you mentioned the unwillingness of Abrahamic religions to have any sort of depiction of God, and of course that gets applied also to the human form as well in many cases. And that's true in Judaism. That's, as far as I know, that's true in Islam, famously. That's true in more Protestant forms of Christianity as well. Of course, with those big white churches that they seem to be fond of, and so that's the first thing, right? And so he really talks about how this whole Christian art thing, which is what I guess you would say Christianity is famous for, is having a depiction of the divine, and even having the sort of um, uh, what is it? That famous picture where who's the guy? I can't remember what the artist's name is. Mr. D will correct me, I'm sure, if he gets around to watching this. He probably won't though. um, the painting where you have I think, is it David touching God,
Oh,
and their
it's
fingers.
Michelangelo. I forget the name of the painting.
Michelangelo.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. I thought it was Michelangelo, but yeah. So what he's really saying is that basically in the strictest interpretation of the Old Testament, that's actually considered a heresy. And so, why does this really exist in Christianity? And because the Jews have the first five books of the Bible, and so it's not like they're unaware. I easily imagine that when the Jews are like, hey, wait a minute, that's a contradiction. Why are you doing this? You don't have any reason. It's not actually in the Bible for any reason of why you're actually depicting human form, why you're actually depicting, divine form, which is prohibited because you don't know that it's the divine form, right? So that's one of the first things he goes on about, and I think that goes back again to the image and deed thing as well. There's a weird connection with imagery and in I guess a pagan sense, and perceiving the divine as an ancient Greek would. And the gods are literally have statues, and we make them, and yeah, even though they're technically representations, the divine can like reside in those statues and all around you, and yeah. So that's an interesting little discussion avenue as well.
I actually have I wrote this whole thing on that because the image stuff in paganism was really interesting to me. Um, you'll like this point. So basically, I read a separate book as well in preparation of this, which I highly recommend you get. It's called The Survival of the Pagan Gods by Jean Sesnek. And the second title is The Mythological Tradition and Its Place in Renaissance Humanism and Art. Because I got very interested in, okay, well, what are the pagan depictions here? And obviously, throughout all of Western civilization, you see all kinds of Greek and Roman myths brought up and depicted, and what do they represent? And what is this relationship to Christianity? So I'll throw a bunch of information at you, I guess, and you can let me know what you think. So basically, like from the book, it argues, so Renaissance humanism is this coagulating force between the ancient gods, Christianity, and then the changing views of man within this world. So this Renaissance humanism kind of fuses Christian allegory with ancient symbols of barbarian religions. And it gets pretty interesting because this goes all the way from the 5th century to the 18th century. You have individuals like Macrobius, Servius, Lactantus Placidus, Marcianus Capella, and Fulgentius. They're all scholars that are living in the 5th century. Some are Christian and some are pagan, but they're not necessarily practicing paganism as a religion, but they're instead kind of viewing it as what Sesnek calls a didactic disquisition. So what this means is it's a long essay intended to provide moral instruction. So this is kind of the place of the pagan gods in Western civilization, is as like an allegory or a story to kind of be a vector for this moral instruction of how man should live in the world. But there are many different changes in how they view the pagan gods. So they go through massive like changes in allegory depictions and what the truth of it is. So there's a text called the Libellus, and it goes through 4 different iterations of the Libellus myth between 4 different authors: Neckham, Petrarch, Berchir, and Albricus II. So there's multiple different depictions of pagan gods in the same myth throughout centuries. And then between the 2 famous, whether you want to call them art historians or art critics, but there's 2 very famous ones called Vasari, who wrote Lives of the Renaissance Artists, and then Cartari. They have this same myth, and they exchange letters with each other. And there's 35 distinct differences in these artistic depictions of the same myth. So do they portray this god with Pegasus, or do they use a different horse? Do they have a torch, or do they not have a torch? Do they use a long dress on a woman or a short one? So these are all very distinct things about the pagans. And I guess I'll kind of continue, and then I'll sum up like a central point in a minute or so. Like basically, in the 14th century in Italy, planetary gods are represented in these icons in iconography. The 7 liberal arts and the labors of the months are also represented by pagan gods via the 7 celestial spheres, which is something that kind of comes from Greece and Rome. So the heroes and the demigods of Rome, they appear in Renaissance Italy And then there's also the fact that the Christian scholars that were illuminating manuscripts chose to preserve heretical or pagan ancient texts and myths. So, for example, Mars symbolizes the rape of Europa, which is prudence. Lucrezia symbolizes the classical triumph of civilization. There's temperance symbolized in the judgment of Solomon. And then you have Diana symbolizing Myrrha and Adonis. And then you also, very interestingly enough, like this is where the occult and the concept of tarot cards come from. So they put together 50 different cards in what was called the Biblia Papernum and the Speculum Humanae Salvationis, which is basically in all of these different myths and depictions of pagan gods and figures, there's all this different variety and variation. So I guess to summarize all of that up, I have like a bunch of different questions about paganism, and we can either go through them now, we can go through them later, but yeah.
Well, okay, so the chat. I keep referencing chapters 13 through 15 because they're the most pertinent, I think, especially in our circles. However, there is one thing, and I just flipped to this page, of course, and we've spoken about this in person, which is the idea of the world as cryptogram, which is what de Benoist says is the Jewish view of how reality actually functions. And we've had some interesting conversations about, okay, well, if you have this idea of the world as a cryptogram, right? Everybody who understands what a cryptogram is, it's like a little cylinder with a bunch of like a thick code on the outside, and you shift everything around and try to figure out what the actual password is. It's like a password lock, basically. And what are the implications of that? Implications of this view is that the world is something which has to be solved. So that is just an interesting little thing, and I thought this was mind blowing when I originally read it. Actually, I would like to read this paragraph so everybody gets an idea of what I'm talking about. Do you
have a page number for that?
Yes, I'm looking at page 105 and 106.
Awesome.
Yeah. He says, to be Jewish, Josie Eisenberg believes, is to have a series of discourses by God and about God readily available in order to know the invisible, incorporeal, intangible. It is to search for God through a language for which the entire history of Israel is only a sonorous echo. And again, one can easily define the Jewish faith in the same terms used by Lacan to describe the unconscious, and say that it is structured like a language. This language is furthermore not without a relationship to the unconscious, since all Jewish exegesis consists of seeking, beyond what has been said, for what the biblical discourse leaves unsaid. This opinion seems to closely echo the words of Jean-Joseph Gou. When the depicted representation is entirely replaced by the logos that absolutely predated it, it is clearly no longer a commentary but a substitute. It should come as no surprise, then, to see flourishing in the field of contemporary ideological discourse, at the same time as Judeo-Christian values are depositing themselves into secular sediment, a whole theme of non-representation and the search for that which is unsaid. This latter impulse has given rise to various epiphenomena, including structural linguistics, historical studies that are not purely descriptive, abstract art, and 1,001 theories of the unconscious. In each case, it is a question of describing without depicting, of considering the world to be somehow a coded complex whose key lies beyond visible appearances. This world is not a place in which forms can be created, but rather a mystery to be interpreted, a puzzle to be put back together, a place in which man, who is viewed not as a creator, intermediary, has the task of discovering a hidden meaning, a necessarily unique meaning that predates his very existence. The idea of the world as cryptogram and that of an absolute signifier allowing it to be deciphered, who might be Yahweh, but could just as well be the unconscious, capital U unconscious, or the class struggle, capital C and S class struggle, then functions like diastole and systole. For those who don't know, that's a heart. Those are the functions of a heart, the different chambers. If the world is, in fact, something other than what it is, there necessarily must be a universal key, inescapable and unsurpassable, which makes it possible to know what in the world partakes of the being. That's capital B being, by the way. That is not the being, undercase B. You can see how tedious this gets
Yeah.
sometimes. Man no longer acts. He is enacted as the decipherer of hieroglyphics. He's got another quote here. For just as Freud took it upon himself to find meaning in dreams, which he compares, as is commonly known, to hieroglyphics, Marx, for his part, undertook to decipher, in his own terms, the hieroglyph of value. And this is why Freud interpreted dreams by precisely following Joseph's example with the Pharaoh, or even that of Daniel with Nebuchadnezzar. Whew. So yes, very interesting.
Yeah, so my kind of take on it, and this is where I found something very complimentary in the Bronze Age Pervert podcast, which is have you ever heard of this book called Ordeal of Civility by
Yes, I've
John
heard
Marie
of it.
Cudahy?
Yes, I watched the cigar stream with Bap on that one. Yes.
So I shelled out like $100 for this book, and it's really interesting because it really deconstructs these three characters: Freud, Marx, Levi Strauss, the fields of basically political science, anthropology, and psychology. And it essentially looks at these three individuals who are foreign to a Western Christian environment with class hierarchy and with very stilted relationships between people, very formal concepts of etiquette, and essentially just relentlessly tries to deconstruct it and to posit this, whether it's the concept of the unconscious, or whether it's the concept of the ego and the superego and the id, or whether it's the communist worldview. It's basically tearing down and positing a foundationless myth, I would say. Like, there's nothing empirical or scientific about Freud. I mean, from a scientific point of view, basically Freud is writing poetry, and Karl Marx could just be doing like ideological masturbation. Like, these are individuals who are looking at this Western structure and essentially trying to deconstruct it as much as they can. And a lot of this comes from kind of a resentment or Jewish nature of very intense criticism or questioning of rules and laws, or debate and discussion. And what's interesting is that in Judaism, there's not so much a ambition. You don't aim to come to the correct interpretation. It's that anything is up for debate and that everything has to be deconstructed. And this is why a lot of the modernists and postmodernists were Jewish. And this is also why they were so intensely against Western civilization as this force, because it was something very alien to them with its rules, which Judaism saw as arbitrary. And I mean, we could do a whole separate stream on that book because it's absolutely phenomenal. But I see a lot of overlap between that and then kind of the nature of these individuals, as you were discussing, with how intensely they would criticize or critique Christianity in the West.
Yeah, and so there's this idea of like the world is as a cryptogram, so the world is something which has to be solved. We have to find the contradictions. We have to find the solution to all these things, instead of just saying there is no solution. There are only trade-offs, and that's a very conservative answer, right? But you know, but yeah, that's an interesting idea on where you get this sort of like the underlying reason for this manic energy that you often see on the left. And actually, I guess you either I kind of wanted to highlight this passage as well because this whole passage basically, and especially the comparison of diastole and systole, which is basically it's a heart, it's a pump, right? And that combined with the assertion that from things like uh, the 60-year timeline that is posited in what is that book? I'm forgetting off the top of my head. The Fourth Turning. Yes. And so there's a 60-year timeline in the Fourth Turning, and I've heard people who are more Protestant or more Christian say there's a 60-year timeline, and this whole idea of a pump inspired my article on the on my analysis of time, basically of time, and this idea of the doom engine that I came up with, which seems to drive our civilization. And essentially, my take is, the diastole and the systole works basically like a four banger engine, essentially, or a two banger engine if you prefer, where you have for everybody who doesn't understand internal combustion engines, basically you have an input phase and where the ideas percolate, and then you have the actual piston starts to move and then begins compression, which puts the fuel under pressure. In diesel engines, you need to have the fuel be pressurized so it can actually combust. And then you have combustion and expansion and then exhaust phase, right? So you have this sort of cyclical motion in and of itself, and this idea of time that seems to go on and on and on. And of course, in my article, I use this whole concept and the 60-year timeline to construct what I thought was happening in Western civilization, which is on my Substack and on my YouTube videos as well, if you want to take a look at that. But this whole passage was what inspired that article. Very fascinating stuff to me. It really stood out when I read it the first time.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see here. I was thinking, I have a bunch of general questions about paganism, because it seems, it's as a Jewish person, the easiest thing in the world to do is to criticize Christianity, right? Or as a non-monotheistic person, it's pretty straightforward to look at either gaps or inconsistencies within Judaism or Christianity or Islam. But I had specific questions about paganism. I was wondering if you'd be willing to answer a few of those before we kind of move forward.
Sure, I can answer a couple questions.
Sure. So I guess. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just preface that by saying I'm not I'm starting with a very theoretically heavy thing, or phase first and foremost. My praxis is okay. Finding a group to actually go and participate in and actually do the rites and the actual praxis of the underlying theological beliefs has been difficult, to say the least.
Sure.
I'm working on that, but yes, my praxis is a little weak, honestly. So, but yeah, I can answer some questions.
Yeah, all good. So my view is I'm very strictly within the monotheistic religions, born and raised Jewish, converting to Orthodox Christianity. So I generally recognize that there are very defined, organized religions about how I should practice, what I should believe, what do I do versus what I shouldn't do. And I guess, what does it mean overall to be a pagan? Because reading this book, you see that there are, for example, he has a section in Tolerance and Intolerance in chapter 17 that I kind of wanted to reference. So I'll read
that's a
that.
controversial one. Yeah, that's definitely one of the ones we should talk about. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess we can save the questions for a sec, but I guess a part that I disagreed with is on page 110. He says in chapter 17, Tolerance and Intolerance, he says, quote, it is generally accepted, it is generally acknowledged that paganism contains a constituent principle of tolerance. A system that accepts a limitless number of gods not only accepts the plurality of the forms of worship that address them, but also and especially the plurality of mores, social and political systems, conceptions of the world for which these gods are so many sublimated expressions. We know that the ancients believed that the best proof of all the gods did or could exist was that the people worshiping them also existed. So I guess my kind of question is, like being from a monotheistic background, when I look at it and I try and understand paganism, I just kind of see chaos. If there are a limitless number of gods that each have individuality based on their adherents, that they believe in them, that they act in a political system that centers the pagan god within them, that sort of runs into this problem where how can you clearly define yourself as either for any one idea or against any specific idea? How do you make sense of morality? Like, why should I be a right-wing pagan as opposed to some kind of Stonehenge pro-abortion Wiccan? I guess it seems a
Yes.
little hazy to me on that subject, because Judaism and Christianity, they are, for better or for worse, they are very dogmatic and clear one way or the other on a multiplicity of issues.
Yeah, and this is where he actually, I don't know if you have that version, but de Benoist has an interview that he did like 15 years after initial publication, and he talks about the lefty pagans. And what he basically says is, if I'm remembering correctly, and this is more of my experience, which is basically they're coming to paganism because it's not Christianity. They're coming to paganism because they perceive it as a victimhood religion, and they need the spiritual but not religious thing. And I can in because it's a something that isn't living, you can't really point to a real tradition, so I can insert things that I want into it. So it's like the perfect, for them at least, it's the perfect do-it-yourself spirituality is what he calls it. So yeah, he criticizes that and he doesn't like it. He's I take a very interesting view on this, right? The criticism of chaos for me is an invalid one, and the reason why I say that is because, well, the world is chaotic. For me, this is not really a problem. Um, I think that's more of a Christian and an Abrahamic problem, because this is where you get into some weird Nazgul territory. Okay. Um, which is basically, I think that paganism can, in my view, it has no problem accepting the Enlightenment, essentially.
Okay, yeah.
So if you're saying, okay, well, you claim the absolute of a divinity, and that, all things are perfect, all things are as God intended, then how explain this bad thing that happens? Well, no, the pagan says the world is inherently chaotic, and that's okay. Um, and of course, this is versus ought distinction, which, by the way, that's an Enlightenment concept, right? A lot of right wingers like to or conservatives like to reference the is ought distinction, but that comes from David Hume, right?
Yeah.
David Hume is an atheist, or at least he was at the time, or was considered one, and that's a pure Enlightenment concept. But for me, that's not a problem to accept that. Whereas for a Christian, you'd have to have a very, very long discourse on the nature of evil, and um, and yeah, we've all seen how that plays out in practice. And so, of course, on a logical level, this is not a contradiction for me at all. Um,
Okay. Yeah, I mean that makes sense. Like, it's very interesting because the monotheistic religions, the reason that people who follow them truly follow them and are observant and are religious tend to be more right wing is because the morality is, I think, an accurate reflection and representation of reality. I think the monotheistic systems basically they do see a clear delineation between good and evil, between moral and immoral conduct, and
Yes.
and we can disagree on what is moral and immoral and what is good and evil even, but the interesting part is that I guess I don't know. I mean, it's a very alien idea to me that there is, uh, how does one really live their life in a system of chaos? Like, well, like
That's easy.
I'll grant you that chaos is like an inevitable part of human existence. People are most assuredly going to sin. They're going to do absolutely crazy things. They're going to rationalize or justify whatever they're going to do. They're going to pray to whoever, conduct themselves in their lives, however. Um,
Yes.
but this is,
Well, the answer, and of course, this is where you get into the overlap of Indo-European religions. There's a wonderful scene which illustrates this. It's from the Bhagavad Gita, actually, and it's to summarize. Basically, you have this whole scene where the main character, the protagonist Arjuna, is just about to go into battle, and he has this crippling doubt, and he has a very long discourse with the god Lord Krishna. And like, I'm not a Hinduism expert by any means, but this is basically the similar way that I tend to believe. Um, and the way that one deals with, and of course he says, how do, what's the phrase? How can one go basically, how do you do anything if you're born in illusion? Um, and so of course the secret way is obviously Lord Krishna teaches him the yoga of wisdom, and he goes on and says, oh, you know he sees the divine, and basically says, Lord Krishna basically says, you have to act, right? It's not, you can't, you it's the concept of detached action, really. um, you must act, but you mustn't let action dominate you, if that makes sense. um, Let me see if I can find that real quick, and pin that to the chat so everybody can get a taste of what I'm talking about. But it's essentially the same religion, right? As everybody likes to, and all the anthropologists like to talk about. So there's a lot of overlap. I have other things to say on it, on the Hindus, but let me see if I can find that real quick.
and I'll absolutely agree with you that before, I mean, even in the Bible, before the monotheistic religions, I mean, there is idolatry. There is paganism is the law of the land everywhere in every society, in every culture. But then I don't know. To me, there seems to be a lot of different caveats with this. You worship the gods and the ancestors of your community, and you practice the beliefs of your culture that are very much tied into your own regional language and to your dialect, and that that your God will have domain over your people. And I guess it's it's interesting. I mean,
That's a universalism versus a particularism debate,
right,
as
and he
well.
does have a chapter on this. I mean, we can get back to the book because
Yes.
I'm sure he'll have some stuff in there. But yeah, let's look into that universal versus particular chapter. I
Yes.
think that's a good point for
Um,
us.
and obviously, I just finished reading The Ancient City, which is basically the pagan answer, or
Yes,
view of how that
excellent book.
actually works in practice, right? And of course, what he says, right, I'm going to read chapter 18, first paragraph right here. Pagan thought, which is fundamentally attached to roots and to place as the preferred center around which identity can crystallize, can only reject all religious and philosophical forms of universalism, right? And of course, he says universalism finds its basis in Judeo-Christian monotheism. So it's very oppositional right off the bat. And of course, Christians and I'm sure Jews would also give as good as they get on this front as well. Um,
Right, and it's fascinating looking at Judaism, because it is like like in my mind, how do I say this? This is very sacrilegious in Judaism, so this is not like the opinion of Jews, but basically the way I kind of view it as I'm exiting Judaism is that Judaism is about the people of the Jews and about the land of the Jews. And so,
Yes,
yes, it's the universal God, but it's the particular person, the particular people, or the
it's
chosen people that are
it's
differentiated from the goyim. So that then
yes,
runs into this, it's this weird thing where I'm looking at a lot of the expressions throughout this book of what pagan thought is, and a lot of it lines up pretty well with Judaism, and how Jews initially viewed themselves. And I mean, even the modern anthropological study of basically ancient Israel and Canaan and the ancient practices of the Jews. I mean, you could make the definitely non-Jewish argument that Jews are a pagan people, which I think actually
I
it holds
I would.
some water.
Mm,
Um,
I would not say so. I would say they are a tribal people, which they're very ethnocentric, right? So everybody also loves talking about what is it? The Christianization of early of Germanic Europe. That one by Russell. That one is also very good because it explains that how these two religions function on a pragmatic level, which is essentially a pagan religion has two things, right? You've got the obvious tribal and ethnocentrism of it as one pillar of it, and the other pillar of it is uh, the magic of it, right? Basically, for lack of a better word, it's a magical practicing religion, and obviously you've got just thinking about men and differences inherent between them. You have men who are very much more typically ethnocentric on average, and from a pagan religious perspective, these things get passed down through the patrilineal line from father to son, as opposed to the women. Well, what are the women going to do? What do you have to offer them? What are they going? How are they going to participate in this? And the answer that Russell comes up with is basically magic, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and what's one interesting thing is basically Judaism was entirely patrilineal until there's a specific sort of I can't remember exactly whether it was kind of the 3rd century or the 5th or maybe even the 10th century, but it at some point Judaism as a matter of survival switched its own nature of descent to be matrilineal, because you can obviously verify matrilineal descent, but it becomes much more different when you have to verify patrilineal descent, because anybody could be a father, so to speak. So that's an interesting point that you bring up.
Hmm.
And let's see here. I like how on 123 and 124 he goes into you can't actually, you sort of can differentiate between different cultural groups of men, but um, you also run into this issue where you have humanity overall, and you know you have to be able to have human uniqueness. And how do you go about this? Basically, he says at the end of 124, quote, whether man's uniqueness is envisioned from the natural level or the theological level, the result is the same in both cases. It is the distinctly human level, the one where man does not define himself in terms of unity but plurality, the one in which he constructs himself in consistently diverse ways and declares himself self-created, that is denied. So this just kind of brings to mind, you know, that individuals can define themselves as conservative or liberal, that they can define themselves as one religion or the other, that they can define themselves as any number of different identity markers, but that ultimately doesn't encompass their whole nature of being. That we're all, not to sound like an Enlightenment asshole, but we're all members of the human race and all of that.
Uh,
And that you run
uh,
into the secularization of it, right? On 125, he goes into a generic man is not, it's the Enlightenment kind of constructs it, not in this pagan way, but in this sort of new ideology of classical liberalism, that you can constitute inherent rights of man. that you have like Marxism, that you can also find like generic man and all these different scholars we talked about, like Friedrich Engels, Levi Strauss, or Freud. So this is like the modern vein of things, which is that generic man is also this irreligious man, right? A classless man, a man without an identity, without a background. And if there's anything that people on the right have observed about reality that they disagree with the left with, it's that, you know, your identity is not changing. It is not something you choose. It is this thing that you are like born into. Like no matter how much I try, I'm always going to be a white dude living in the United States. You know, I might have my religion, I might have my culture, I might even change religions, but like I can't change my race, I can't change my gender. And that kind of approaching this generic man ideal is basically this modern fiction. And this is where like particularism and paganism, I think, does come into play of, you know, this is a way to differentiate between various people.
Yeah, I think so. Uh, I,
I'm going to very quickly run to the restroom. Give me 1 sec.
sure.
Be right back.
So let me see. What else could I talk about? Let me see if I can go to tolerance and intolerance again. That was one of the more controversial ones. Let me just see if I can pick out a few quotes for you guys so you get a taste of it. Let's see. Which chapter is it? Ah. 128. Okay. There we go. Page 128. Where is it? Oh, he's already back. Yes. So just I got a highlighted quote here from the tolerance and intolerance chapter.
I'm back, but I'll
Yes, I was finding a quote while you were gone. I was flipping through too long. So he says, the assertion of the non-guard par excellence, my kingdom does not belong to this world. And he cites John 18:36, finds his opposition in the divine assertion par excellence. The abode of men is the abode of the gods. And that's a quote from Heraclitus. So yes, that's that. Let's see. This is from Tolerance and Intolerance. The temptation is therefore quite great in such a system to interpret the other in this world as a simple projection of the self, which can then lead to the desire to eliminate everything in it that is different and does not conform to this projection. And of course, the other in this world is his description of Yahweh, that is to say, the divine. He uses this weird terminology of the absolute other for Yahweh, and he wants to highlight the distinction between Yahweh as a sort of alien god almost. So this is precisely the case with racist xenophobia, which carries with it an interpretation of a reductive, monotheist nature and consists of instituting, whether explicitly or not, a Unitarian, one-dimensional hierarchy connected to allegedly objective criteria, which are in fact pure projections of individual values. That's a controversial statement right there. But this is also the case, and even more so perhaps, for the racism of identity denial or the racism of assimilation, as opposed to the racism of exclusion that consists of reducing the other to the same and proclaiming that there are only men and peoples who are all like the others. Subsequently, and I have this section highlighted, this implicitly legitimizes the destruction of the unique way of life of a populace, the disintegration and absorption of its institutions and beliefs, of its characteristic moral, social, and cultural values, and the loss of its personality, its destiny, and its soul. By asserting the primacy of the completely other, biblical monotheism creates secular conditions for the devaluation of the other. But by the same stroke, they also dialectically create the conditions for a denial of the relative same. Indeed, if the other is devalued, then the others tend to amount to sames. Humanity is no longer composed of relative others and relative sames. Instead, it is made up of the appearance of others, of almost sames, of others with the vocation of sames, in the face of the sole absolute of the completely other. This is why the biblical resistance to the domination by the other can also caricature itself in resistance to domination by the same, whose counterpart is an acceptance of domination by the completely other. And he says, he ends this with a Nietzsche quote. He says, undoubtedly Nietzsche is one of those who best perceived this division. Evoking paganism, he writes an aphorism from the Gay Science entitled The Greatest Advantage of Polytheism. And he says, there is only one norm, man, and every people thought that it possessed this one ultimate norm. But above and outside, in some distant otherworld, no one was permitted to behold a plurality of norms. One God was not considered a denial of another God, nor blasphemy against him. It was here that the luxury of individuals was first permitted. It was here that one first honored the rights of individuals. The invention of gods, heroes, and overmen of all kinds, as well as near men and undermen, dwarfs, fairies, centaurs, satyrs, demons, and devils, was the inestimable preliminary exercise for the justification of the egoism and sovereignty of the individual, the freedom that one conceded to a god in relation to his other gods. One eventually also granted to oneself in relation to laws, customs, and neighbors. Monotheism, on the other hand, this rigid consequence of the doctrine of one normal human type, the faith in one normal God beside whom there are only pseudo-gods, was perhaps the greatest danger that has yet confronted humanity. Of course, that whole last section was a Nietzsche quote, so that's not new stuff. But he basically is saying that he accepts the Nietzschean criticism. Yes, and of course he goes into Yahweh, talking about how he's a jealous God and all of that. And I have another highlight here a few pages later, which is, in this context, this obligation to hate one's parents would be a corollary of not wanting children. And I just highlighted that as well because that's, to me, is an interesting interpretation of woke millenarianism. Yes, and of course, this whole process of disintegration and absorption is the ongoing process that we are now undergoing. So very, very controversial for sure. And in as many words, he's basically saying, dude, this is a Christian problem. This is an Abrahamic problem. This is you guys' issue here.
But yes. I guess my concern with it is that it doesn't seem to posit polytheism as a solution. Like, I would argue you could have this entire quote as is and then change the last word, like the greatest danger, to like the greatest benefit or solution that has yet confronted humanity, because it seems, if paganism is this pantheon of limitless gods, and that there's always this inclination by man to try and approach or to understand the other, like, surely isn't it a better alternative for man to choose a single, or to believe in a single other, than it is to have like a multiplicity of doctrines and a multiplicity of groups? Like, doesn't this have the same kind of caustic, dissolving potential that woke millenarianism has, but just on the right? I mean, that would be my kind of criticism of it.
Yeah, and he, to be fair, criticize de Benoist here. He really doesn't give too much And of course, there's like we mentioned he's very Nazbol, right? Of course, so a lot of this sounds very much like new left criticism of Christianity, basically, which essentially it is. But it's interesting to hear it coming from somebody on the right, and to hear new atheist takes like 40 years before before new atheism
Yes.
was a thing, which I mean is an interesting aside, a sidebar, I guess, on all social criticism inevitably comes from the right wing first, and then the left probably just picks up on it.
There is a section here that I very much disagree with. He says at the end of 115, there have been massacres and exterminations everywhere at all times, but one will seek in vain in the sacred or profane texts of paganism for an equivalent of what can be found repeatedly throughout the Bible. The idea is that such massacres can be morally justified. The idea that they can be expressly authorized and desired by a god. I mean, I, I
Yeah.
surely the Vikings went to Britain and said that you have the wrong god, right? Surely these pagan cultures were
Yeah.
not they were not in contact with each other without some kind of secular justification for wars against each other, right? The reason that they are going to war with each other is a pagan reason, right? That they
Yes.
do believe that their god, as like an expression of whatever you want to call it, like Nietzschean will, like that the Norse gods will triumph over the God of Christ, right? So I guess I don't know. I mean, this all boils down to, like, my big issue in this book is that I know I'm saying it a lot, but there's such an intense criticism of monotheistic morality. But I guess I really do not see enough in the book that supports the idea that pagan morality would conduct worldly affairs any better, right? It can be better out of principle. Like I'm not gonna assert that it somehow wouldn't be, but it just seems, yeah, I mean, the Romans are a pagan people, and how many different pagan groups did they conquer and destroy? And is the whole world this balance of might makes right? And as like a monotheistic person, I think that's, it is not moral, it is not correct, it is not the end vision of what we should have as the ideal state. And obviously,
Well,
like, reality can differ from the ideal, so
yes.
I'll concede that one.
Yeah, and this is what I think is in the most tepid criticism, and I think that this is why I brought up David Hume is odd distinction, because where you get down to it,
Yeah,
I think that that is an ought decision, that Christianity says the world ought to be better, it ought to be this way, and I think the pagan reply is, well, but it's not like that. Which is that's a truth claim also, right? Because if you're saying, okay, well, the world should be like this is where it should go, and we have to get to this point, is that not a utopian impulse, I guess? But de Benoist also, you're correct that he's absolutely a almost kind of contradicting himself in a way. Um, he it would be much better if he just said literally, okay, yes, unfortunately, might does make right, and that's just the way that it is. I don't think that um, I don't think that he's really being honest with himself about that. I think he's very much um, inundated with a lot of like new left talking points regarding Christianity, and you can tell from his writing that he is.
yeah.
But I don't think I think that there are better criticisms, really, and I think that truth claim, which is the world should be like this, and I just say, well, that's not the way that it is, and that's not the way that it could ever be. You can trim around the edges, but ultimately, everything comes down to force. Basically, is my take, and that's extremely unfortunate. That doesn't mean that I want the world to be like that. It doesn't mean that I want I want to be conquered, but unfortunately, I wonder, and I understand you don't have very long left for the to participate in this, but yeah, to me that's just a truth claim, and I think that for me that's just false, basically. Um,
Sure. And there's other, I mean, I would also recommend, I mean, there are, nothing against this text, but if you have a chance, you should check out the Penguin Metaphysical Library. They put out this book called The Sword of Gnosis, which has like Rene Guénon and Titus Burckhardt, and it's all about metaphysics, cosmology, tradition, and symbolism. So it really is much more uh, kind of intensive, and it also incorporates Islam into this as well, describing like the Catholic Church in crisis, Oriental metaphysics. Is there the concept of grace in Buddhism? I mean, I will concede that a lot of pagan thought. I mean, one thing that I really objectively like about it is that it is able to look critically at a lens that is much more subtle and nuanced than just, I don't like the Catholic Church because they have a bad pope, or religion is the source of all evil. I think it is a much better criticism of the Western system than something like the New Atheists or like a leftist could ever come up with. I think there's a lot of benefit here. And as to the concept of an other is a very interesting thing, because even in the Torah, I mean, the Jews are not in a world where it is the God of the Jews and no other gods. It is the God of the Jews and false gods, basically. So there is that pagan presence permeated throughout the world, and the relationship with the other, at least initially in the 5 books of Moses, it is a book of conquering. Like, the Israelites went to war against the Canaanites. They went to war with all different groups of people to take the land, in their own quest for the establishment of a land and the executing of their religion. They had to, do things which, by their own system, would not be considered moral. And I think it does get to that root of, um, you know, is man battling against the other, like the quote that you read. So I think that's a very interesting point. I guess. So I have about 25 minutes left. Were there any other major sections in the book that you would like to cover? If you want to
yes,
open it up to questions, entirely up to you.
yeah. I don't think we'll open it up to questions. There's just not that many comments.
Gotcha.
So I think we should probably address chapter 19.
Sure.
That's probably the one that is going to also be rather controversial, um, and of course we love controversy here. Um, so chapter 19, I'm going through my highlights right, and I'm just going to try to be quick here because we are on a time limit.
Mhm.
So basically, he makes the assertion, and I quote. In other words, all men are equal before Yahweh because they all share the same origin. Um, the differences between men are secondary with respect to their common identity vis-a-vis Yahweh. Um, they are of little account in comparison to him, just as the other is of little value when compared to the completely other. All men are essentially equal. All men are placed at an equal distance from Yahweh. The anthropological foundation of the biblical theory of politics is perfectly clear. Um, And then, of course, he goes on to talk about another interesting little fact, which I didn't know, um, which is the whole ideology of the Mosaic Code sanctifies the primacy of the judge over the king and of moral and juridical affairs over political and military ones. Um, that sentence, I think, is one that I definitely would like you to comment on,
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
we've seen it before. Yes.
Right. So what we're looking at here, I mean, so there are the 5 books of Moses, but you also have the Book of Kings, Samuel, Numbers. You have all these different other books, which are basically, in Judaism, uh, the Book of Judges. I mean, it's all of these different areas in which the law is triumphing over the king, or over rulers, or over different prominent citizens. So this is a very interesting thing, because it gets into the nature of like how was the land of Judea, how was the Jewish world and kingdom? How is the society subdivided? I mean, you have 12 different tribes of Israel, but you also have a situation where the law is considered divine over kings. I mean, this is not like the Christian or the Western ideal. This is
No.
something very alien, that a judge can pass a ruling or a verdict on a king. Um, and this is also where even different kings have different levels of righteousness, or being a wicked king, or being a just king. And I think kind of the overall premise of this, the presupposition within Judaism, is that the law as it comes down, the Mosaic Code, is divine. And it is divine over all men, whether it's the lowest man, or whether it's a king. Whereas in the Western tradition, Christianity, um, traditionally the monarch was viewed as fully sovereign over the subject. There's a great book called The Divine Right of Kings by I think John Figgis, a British guy, 19th century. And it's essentially that these are two very contrasting views of what the nature of the political structure ought to be in a monotheistic religion. I mean, even in Jesus's time, there was the Sanhedrin. In the current era, I think that it's called the Rabbanut, which is it's not the Beit Din, but basically over every aspect of Jewish life, there is a panel of judges that interpret the law and have supremacy over all matters. And in Israel today, they dictate all marriages. They dictate really all relations between people when you get down to it. Um, what this essentially means is that the king, to be a truly divinely mandated king, you have to study the Torah and apply it. You must keep very close watch over the scriptures, like de Benoist says in page 129. Like, the great king is neither a builder nor a conqueror. He is one who governs according to the Bible and strives to realize the moral ideas of the Torah. So basically, this biblical model really is kind of over the centuries become the model that influenced the American system. And when you have the system of a concept of checks and governments, politics being submitted to a judiciary, he also continues, political problems are fundamentally a moral problem. Um, he says specifically the American nomocracy, Republic of Judges, the the intense connection between the American constitutional law and the Mosaic Code. Now, this also could be because all the American founding fathers were Freemasons, right? Like, there is that element to it as well. But when you really look at it, it's not the American system is not a Christian system, and this is where I think we can kind of turn it to modernity a little bit.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
you can clearly see, right. And of course he does make a comparison on the same page between the Supreme Court playing a privileged role, and that he thinks that there's a he is a quote here by Paul Castell, who says, "One cannot help but be struck by the dialectical kinship of American constitutional law and the Mosaic Code." And really, what is he implying here? Well, he's basically saying that if you have civil rights and the law, right, gets placed above the sovereign, right? The law must be superior to the sovereign, is what he's saying. The sovereign does not interpret the law; the law constrains the sovereign. That's the relationship here that he's talking about. Well, of course, if you have in our system a republic where you technically are supposed to have some level of popular sovereignty, then you get a system which has a civil rights regime. If you have some sort of law placed above the people, or placed as a superior form of law, well, then that's going to be above the people. And so the law comes above the people.
Right. I mean, the other interesting thing I would say about America is that basically the construction of this system where the law can take precedent over any man basically opens the door to limitless corruption. I mean, like, there are stories of kings within the Bible that become insanely corrupt. Like, for example, Herod was a Jewish king, and in the New Testament, he's a very corrupt person. The Pharisees are very corrupt Jews. This is the whole mission of Christ, is to point out and to make a new covenant, because the idea is that the Jewish covenant has essentially fallen out of step with the divine mission on earth. And I mean, very strange connection here, but there is a separation between church and state. Initially, the founding fathers did this to allow every possible denomination of Protestantism to flourish in this country. But it was so insanely naive to assume that this system would not be vulnerable to any corruption because of some nebulous or metaphysical understanding of separation of checks and powers. I mean, you and I know that elite theory is real, and that power corrupts, and that all of these different the ideology that does not claim to be religious, well, this woke progressivism, it's this caustic force that can create its own law, and that it now sits as this divine, so to speak, construction over all the judiciary. So the moment you basically rip Christianity out of the American system, in my view, you totally cede ground to progressivism. And this is also a tragic flaw of monotheistic governance, if it's not in very strict, rigid, multi-generational and eternal continuity with that divine mission. I think you could make a very legitimate criticism of the nomos, the legal structure of monotheism. I mean, you see this exact problem in Israel today. So, for example, the secular state of Israel wants to run buses on Shabbat, which is a holy day in Judaism, and the Orthodox forbid it. So in Israel, it's this massive battle over whether you have buses running or not. And it's a theological debate from a religious angle in a secular state, applying to both groups of people, where there is no monotheistic authority to dictate one way or the other on the issue. And both of these groups, the secular and the theological, supposedly have authority here. And, right at the end of page 130, just kind of tying this all together, in this regard, there's a logical relationship between the challenging of man's authority over man and the assertion of Yahweh's authority over the human race. The mastery of man by man is challenged proportionately to the very extent that it is exponentially transferred to God. So, I mean, just a perfect iteration is the biggest problem that the nomos in monotheism opens up is an authority problem.
Yeah, well, we got about 10 minutes left here. I do have a couple more things I would like to say before we log off. The first is to reiterate, because Benoist has a wonderful quote here, it's only a sentence, as to what the pagan view is. And he says, the classic equation of paganism is, quote, good equals noble equals powerful equals beautiful equals happy equals beloved of God. End quote. So that's his view, and I kind of share that. The only one other last quote that I have here is there's an interesting footnote he has, which we talked about before we logged on, and I'd like to talk about it for the audience real quick before we log off. Mm-hmm. And that is the one about the Orthodox Jewish circles. He says, in some ultra-Orthodox Jewish circles, a non-Jewish guest does not have the right to open a bottle of wine at a get-together. This custom, for which there is no ritual prohibition, is explained by the fact that in antiquity it was pagan custom to offer the gods libations of wine. Because of this, and to avoid any hint of impurity, the ingestion of wine handled by a pagan was prescribed. And of course, in Western culture, to offer somebody a glass of a beverage from your own hand is considered something that's very, very, I'm honoring you by doing this. And you can, as a cultural tension, you can just imagine the awkward scene of having, a recent Jewish immigrant to some, Western country where, this still kind of culturally exists. And you have a guy who's giving somebody a drink and saying like, here, take it, you're my friend, I want to be friends with you. And then the Jewish guy just goes, no. So
Yeah.
just the setup to conflict basically from the very beginning.
Right. And there's some interesting things there. I mean, the first thing is that, kind of there is a Christian practice of hospitality to all men. And that, there is also a lot of survival of different pagan customs within Christianity. I think that's an area we'll have to go over some other time, but it's the the pagan rules of welcoming a guest and everything else, and how much of modern cultural Christian customs are actually, you know, the teachings of Christ versus some kind of pagan remnant of survival, the Christmas trees, any of these different items. Whereas in, for Judaism, the reason, I mean, like you say, there's no mandate in the Torah that says a goy cannot pour wine in a company of Jewish people, right? It's this custom. And the reason that it's a custom is, the same reason that I'm also considering moving out of Judaism, which is that Judaism is so intense about defining itself via its in-group, who is a member, who is not. Um, you know, Christians are not really welcomed with open arms on Shabbat. If you're a Christian, you're not really encouraged to go to a synagogue. Whereas the Christian ethos is very different. You're supposed to welcome the guest. You're supposed to be hospitable. And that you can have different Christians from different parts of the world that will all be treated the same, and that you're supposed to open your home and hearth to another man, another guest, that there are these certain metaphysical pagan principles which survive in Christianity. I think there's a very interesting line of thought there. And, again, it's something that Judaism does that is very illogical, right? It seems to kind of go against the overall mission, but a lot of different areas you can look in the Talmud, there's a lot of hate. There's a lot of a disregard for different cultural groups. There's also a lot of construction of different ideas within Judaism that are antagonistic to Christians. They say a lot of horrible things about Jesus. And it's what can really be the main description of why this is other than vanity. So that's kind of my take on it.
Interesting. Yeah, there's one last quote that I have, or a couple of last quotes, if I can get them in quickly,
Yeah, please
that
do.
I have here as the last one. So he says, basically, he's basically against the Christian view that pride is a sin, right? Henceforth, the sin of sins, the sin par excellence, will be pride, the lack of humility, or to put another way of using a related word, the intention of not being humiliated. And of course, he says comes from the desire for human autonomy, et cetera, et cetera. And he says the sin of pride finds its archetype in the non-servium of Lucifer, the rebel angel who was also the light bearer. From this point forward, Prometheus and especially Faust will eternally be in the defendant's chair. Which that's an interesting point that he brings up there, which is essentially he's agreeing with Nietzsche. He's like, yes, actually, we like will to power. We like being strong.
Right. And I mean, it reminds me, weirdly enough, of like the Bronze Age mindset quote that we live in the longhouse and the matriarchy and this like stultifying need to conform to various rules where men are not like allowed to either make mistakes or to assert like will or to assert aggression, which are all very natural things. And that,
it's risk aversion. It's just a lot of risk aversion.
exactly. And anybody who's familiar with the history of the West knows that the only reason this whole thing exists to begin with is because a bunch of men were defiant and took risks and exercised their will to power and, executed both great good and great evil upon the world, for better or for worse. And that, you see the end point of this rather anti-Nietzschean society that we live in, where it's very stultified codified and progressivism is taken over, and you have women judges and women priests. It's that there's no domain or avenue for the will to power to actually rise and to conquer. It all is suppressed. It is viewed as the ultimate evil, and I'm not really certain if that is like a direct connection to monotheistic religions, but I think, Judaism is matriarchal, and in Judaism, the mother tends to have a vast majority of the power over the community and of the family, and you are there is a deference there towards mothers. I'm not saying you shouldn't honor your mother or whatever, but basically, like what becomes of the male role and the male will to power, other than to just be sublimated to this great religion which seeks to divide it.
Yeah. There's one last quote that I have just to cap everything off for us, because we're getting very close to the end here. Of course, Benoist, in his conclusion, basically essentially reasserts, like, okay, yes, we love that, we love the will to power. Where is it? Oh yes, man. He thinks man is a preeminently the giver of meaning. Meaning is not non-existent in paganism. It is tied to man's will and is therefore necessarily plurivocal. And he also goes on to say, the greatest bestowal of meaning that can possibly be imagined is the one which announces and anticipates the renaissance of the gods. And he says, in conclusion, what do we want? We want, through a new beginning, to realize the appropriation, which is the reciprocal implication of being in time. We wish to realize the triumphal synthesis announced by Joachim of Fiore. We wish to oppose faith against law, mythos against logos, the innocence of becoming against the guilt of the creature, the legitimacy of the will toward power against the exaltation of servitude and humility, and man's autonomy against his dependency. We value desire over pure reason, life over the problematic, the image over the concept, a sense of place over exile, the desire for history over the end of history, and the will that transforms and yeasays, it's Nietzschean language there, the world over negativity and refusal. People of these hard times, writes Robert Sabatier, you must relearn the language of the sun. You must decimate the demons of the night. And for that, you must project into the world the essential questioning. That which remains, Holderlin said, the poets have founded. And that's the end of the book.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so my final defense of monotheism here is essentially, I would argue, at least in the Christian understanding and the Jewish understanding, that, you are sublimating yourself to God, and you are in a sort of submission. That is also, this is not like something where your will is like entirely sublimated. You are actually seizing control over your will by fighting against vices, by seeking virtue, by seeking out and going through suffering so that you may be remolded stronger and more virtuous. I think that there is, like, in contrast to the Nietzschean vision where you exert this will upon the world, I think there is a sort of, I mean, if you look at the life of a monk and the Desert Fathers or the ascetics or any other instance of a person, like, I very much believe like that people in a monotheistic religion can yes, they will sublimate their temporary will, but there is a greater, more sublime truth or strength and virtue that comes out of that. This, you can master, like, to master yourself is a greater expression of will. To go and deliberately seek out suffering that you might overcome it takes more strength than just to merely enact your will upon the world. I think there is like a counterpoint within monotheism to this Nietzscheanism, which I don't think is addressed enough. And like, yes, like religion, you could argue religion is like this stifling force which only ever seeks to destroy the individual's passions and to mold them into just another member of the religion. But I think there is this counterpoint, which is that through enough submission, you gain this intense inner strength and a more profound and powerful will. I mean, you might disagree with this, but that's kind of the monotheistic religion. That's why I like the apotheosis of Christianity as being a monk. or being a hermit, like living totally alone, battling all of the elements and wild animals, and that submission can also lead through strength.
Yeah, I do disagree. I tend to agree with Benoit on this issue. And of course, I think it's a question of this. The submission is to me asking permission, and I'm not sure we have time for all of that. But
Fair
that's
enough.
me.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on. I mean, wonderful, wonderful stuff. I mean, there's so many different books and ideas we could continue to talk about. I would absolutely love to do this again if you'd have some time. This book was a blast. Like, at times it made me very angry. It was very thought provoking. But I think that's a good thing. I think it is very important to read books that challenge you in your worldview, because I mean, ultimately that's how you grow. So,
Yes, this is true.
and there are a lot of legitimate points within this book, and there are, any religion can get corrupted, and look at all the different denominations of the monotheistic religions. It's not like they're this perfect entity. Every denomination will assert that they are the true one. So, there's all kinds of issues there, and I think, to understand and to look at paganism through this way, I think de Benoist, he has an excellent angle. There are things I agreed with him on a lot. There are things I really disagreed with him on, but overall, like, very worth your time to read.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And because understanding these little divides is so absolutely important, especially for us on the right. And because he does so in a theological and very thoughtful and well cited and serious manner. So, yes, I think that pretty much concludes our stream. Would you like to give your shill, sir?
Yeah, so brief shill. So I have a YouTube channel called Philos Miscellany. If you look me up, I'll have the same avatar, PvP, whatever, and the same name. Basically, my overall goal is I own about 300 rare books, everybody from very rare Spengler to Mircea Eliade to Eric von Cohen-Ledin. Basically, like, any right-wing thinker that you have, Burnham, whoever, I have all these books, and they're getting very hard to find, very scarce. So I'm basically doing 10-minute book reviews of based and very obscure books that you should read, and presenting them in like the classic right-wing video essay format. And I just, I highly recommend you go to a used bookstore, because, we're moving towards the age of the great digital Gnostic demon. And, it will be very, very hard to find and understand these concepts. I mean, we talked a lot about on this show, but if you look at the state of modern culture, where can you find anything near the level of depth and nuance as one of these books? So just please read, please check out my channel, like and subscribe. Mandrill's channel. He has a great YouTube channel. He's a great guy in our sphere. Met him personally, great man as well. So that's my show.
Thank you very much. Yes, and of course, you can subscribe to my channel. Please be sure to share, like all of the things. You can follow me on Twitter. You can find me on Gab. I'm on Telegram. I do stuff for the Old Glory Club. Please, if you have monies, you can throw money their way. Or also, if you prefer, I do have, because I know I don't have super chats enabled quite yet, Entropy's screwy. I do have a Buy Me a Coffee account, which I've linked in the show notes. And so if you would like, you can throw me a $5. I appreciate any monies that come my way, even if it's just a couple bucks. So if you enjoyed this content, do please give. And the last thing that I have to show is Skeptical Waves has uploaded the text-to-speech version of this book. If you are not somebody who reads, if you're somebody who prefers to listen, it is available on his channel. He has a whole playlist with all of the chapters available. So go check that out as well. And with that, I think we are good to go for the day. So goodbye, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Take care.